Today we look at some patterns of how you get variation and how also the DNA sequence evolves or sequence evolution. The how many of you have heard about the modern synthesis? Are there a lot of non-biologists here? Okay. The modern synthesis was an outcome of the synthesis of several things. One was Darwin's theory of natural selection, evolution through natural selection, along with Mendel's laws and population genetics theory. There were several tenets of the modern synthesis that were largely agreed upon. One was that genetic variation occurs at random. It could occur through mutation or through recombination. That populations evolve through changes in allele frequencies. So if we had chromosomes, the position of some gene on that chromosome is the locus. And at this locus, you can have alternative forms of the gene. So you could have, say, a capital A and a small a. These would be alleles, right? So if you had a set of diploid individuals in the population and you had these alleles, you could calculate the frequency of allele capital A and allele small a. So those would be allele frequencies. So the frequency of allele A would be 3 out of 6 and, sorry, 4 out of 6, and the frequency of small allele A would be 2 out of 6 here. Now, if you had the population changing over time, you could have a change in these allele frequencies across time. And evolution was thought to be, is thought to be change in allele in the genetic composition of populations across time. These allele frequencies can change through mutation. Either this allele now becomes replaced with something else, or it could change through recombination across time. The composition could change by, sorry, you could have the composition of the population changing through mutation. You could have drift, which we will come to, and through natural selection. Now, it was also thought that population processes on this short-term scale carried over during the long term would give rise to larger evolutionary changes. Now, one of the debates about the amount of variation was that how much standing genetic variation is present in the population at any point in time. There were two theories relating to this, the classical school and the balanced school. The classical school were the descendants intellectually of Malthus, where they thought of natural selection as a negative force. So natural selection would act to purify the genome of harmful variants. It was thought that every mutant that arose would tend to be deleterious in some way. The majority of mutations would be deleterious. And therefore, natural selection would act to purify the genome of these deleterious mutations. So if you thought of natural selection as purifying selection, you would tend to have a single variant or a single allele at a particular locus in the population, and new alleles that arose would tend to be deleterious and would tend to be removed. So if you screen individuals in the population for variability, you would find very low variation. Now we can look at variation in terms of polymorphism. A locus is said to be polymorphic if there are more than one allele at that locus. So at this locus, we have this capital A and small a. So there are different alleles at this locus. So this locus would be polymorphic. you could also have individuals at a locus being heterozygous or not. So if you had the same allele type at both the homologous chromosomes, this individual is homozygous, while this individual, where you have different alleles at that locus, is heterozygous at this locus. So you could also look at the proportion of loci in an individual that are heterozygous or homozygous. You could also look at the proportion of individuals at a particular locus that are heterozygous. So the proportion of heterozygous loci, or the proportion of individuals that are heterozygous, and the polymorphism of loci would be indications of how much variability there is in a population. So according to the classical school, if natural selection tended to act through purifying selection, you would find low levels of heterozygosity and polymorphism. Right? So according to this school, you would occasionally have mutants that were beneficial, and they would very quickly rise to fixation, while the majority of the time there would be only a wild type, a so-called wild type allele, and new mutants would generally tend to be deleterious. So if a new allele arose that was beneficial, that would quickly rise in the population in frequency and then become the wild type. On the other hand, according to the Balance school, there was a lot of standing genetic variation in the population. So if you remember the Victorian era naturalists, they went out and looked at natural populations in the wild, and they found a lot of variability. So following that tradition, people from the Balance school thought that there was a lot of variability if you went out and looked at populations in the wild, and therefore there must be genetic variability mirroring that phenotypic variability that one saw everywhere around. According to the Balance school, there was a lot of genetic variability. So you would find most individuals to be heterozygous at the loci that was screened, and you would also find a lot of polymorphism across different loci. Now, how would this natural variation be maintained? They hypothesized that there would be different balancing mechanisms that would give rise to this variability. So these balancing mechanisms could be, for instance, higher heterozygote fitness. We saw yesterday that you could have a situation, for instance, where if you had 3 genotypes like this at one locus, and the fitness of the heterozygote was greater than the fitness of the homozygote, then because of Mendelian inheritance, you would keep generating these homozygotes from this heterozygote. So the heterozygote would never get fixed. You would keep having all of these 3 different types. Right? So that could be one mechanism. You could also have frequency-dependent selection, where the fitness of one particular type is dependent on its frequency and the frequency of other types in the population. So you could imagine a situation where if this was frequency, if the frequency of some type rose, then its fitness decreased, and therefore the frequency would then decrease. Once it decreased, it was advantageous for this type to increase again, so because the fitness is greater, and therefore you could have an oscillation. This is not the only type of frequency dependence that you can have, but this is one type of frequency dependence. So because of frequency dependent mechanisms or heterozygote advantage, or you could also have a situation where there are two different areas and one particular type does better in this area, another type does better in that area, but these types may have to make their living in both these areas, and therefore you could have both these types existing in that larger population. So you can have these different mechanisms which would give rise to the maintenance of different allele types. Now, the initial support for the balanced school came from the amount of diversity that is seen in natural populations. It also came from the fraction of phenotypic variation that could be attributed to the genetic influence by rearing individuals of different genotypes in a common environment. So for instance, if you had organisms with different trait values in different populations, and you want to find out whether these trait values arise because of the environmental differences in these two populations or because of their genetic background, what you could do is to rear them in a common environment. So these are called common garden experiments, where you can take individuals from two different environments, rear them in the same environment, and see what happens to their trait value. If you find that, for instance, you have large and small variants of some fish in two different ponds, and then you rear them in a common environment, and you find that these large fish tend to be large even in this common environment, and here you have this tending to be small again, then you would suspect that there was a genetic influence to this phenotypic trait. If you found that you had some common phenotype in the common environment, then you would suspect that the environmental conditions in these two populations were giving rise to that phenotypic trait value. Right? So when these kinds of common garden experiments were done, it was found that a lot of phenotypic variation could be attributed to genetic influences. It was also seen that there was very fast responses to selection, which could again be suggestive of a lot of genetic variability, because you would need genetic variability to have a response to selection. But this was in the starting from the 1930s, and at that point there was no way of actually finding out how many genes or what proportion of genes were polymorphic or heterozygous, or what proportion of loci were heterozygous. Later, with the advent of protein electrophoresis, one could find out what proportion of loci were polymorphic or heterozygous. In protein electrophoresis, what is done is that one can take tissues from an individual, from organisms, and run these denatured proteins in a gel with electric current passed through it, so that proteins separate out depending on their net charge. Okay? So there could be different forms of the same protein which differ in their amino acids, such that the net charge of that protein is different, and therefore they would migrate at different rates on that gel. So if you had a situation like this, where these are homozygotes, A and A prime, and you have a heterozygote here. If the protein is a monomer, so it consists of one unit, you could have a single band corresponding to this homozygote. You could have a single band corresponding to this homozygote, but this is of a different size from this. And you have two bands corresponding to each of these alleles in a heterozygote. If the protein is a dimer, you would have three bands here because you can have the AA variant, the A prime variant, and you could also have an A prime dimer. Right? You can stop me at any point if you want. So by doing this, by running out proteins on a gel, you can find out what kind of variability there is at that protein. Initially, the number of loci that one could screen depended on the histochemical stains that were available to stain these different proteins, because you would have to see that protein on the gel, so you would have to use a histochemical stain to visualize that protein. Now, later though, with the advent of sequencing, you could also look at the DNA sequence. When protein electrophoresis was done, it was found that the genomes of Drosophila and humans had more than 30% of the genes that were assayed that were polymorphic, and 10% that were heterozygous within individuals. When sequencing was done, it was found that there was more variability. So, sequencing was done, it was found that there was more variability. So, if you have a stretch of DNA such as this, DNA carries information, right? And we have triplets of nucleotides. So each of these is a nucleotide, A, C, G, and T. And we have these triplets that eventually will give rise to one amino acid. But because there are 64 combinations of these 3 nucleotide bases, and there are only 20 amino acids, there are multiple triplets like this, which are called codons, which code for the same amino acid. Okay? And usually these differ in the third position. So you might have ACG corresponding to something, ACG corresponding to the same amino acid. I mean, I don't know what these correspond to, but you could have the third position here differing, but both of these giving rise to the same amino acid. Okay. We also have, so therefore, this, if there was a substitution of this nucleotide G with T, and this gave rise to the same amino acid, that would be a synonymous substitution. If there was a substitution where, for instance, G was substituted here, supposing A was substituted here by C, and these gave rise to 2 different amino acids, then this would be a non-synonymous substitution. So when you do sequencing, you can find that there are differences in the sequence which correspond to the same amino acids. So when proteins were initially screened, one might not be able to find differences in those proteins, but there could still be differences at the level of the DNA sequence. So it was found that there was a greater proportion of variation than originally thought. Now, just because we found that there was genetic variability does not mean that the balancing mechanisms had to be true. So according to the Balance school, there was a lot of genetic variability, and that was because of various balancing mechanisms like frequency dependent selection or heterozygote advantage. But just because there was a lot of genetic variability did not imply that this variability had to result from balancing mechanisms. Okay? And one of the reasons to think that it might not be balancing mechanisms was because of the concept of the genetic load, which is the extent to which the fitness of an individual is below the optimum fitness. So if you remember, the classical theory held that most mutations were deleterious, and therefore if you happen to have one wild type and you had mutants in the population, these mutants would be deleterious. The fitness of those individuals would be lower than the optimum fitness. Now, there would still be these individuals with the mutant allele till the point that a new wild type allele, which was favorable, reached fixation. That is, reached a frequency of 1. So until all the individuals in the population had the most favorable allele, there would be some individuals in that population which had not so favorable alleles. And therefore, the fitness of those individuals would be lower than that of the optimum fitness that you could get from the most favorable allele. So supposing we took if we looked at a single locus and 2 alleles, and both of these alleles, capital A and small a, had the same frequency, and the genotypes had different viabilities, that is, they could survive to different extents. Now, if we use the probability of surviving to reproduction as 40%, 50%, and 30%, we could now scale all of these to the one with the maximum probability of survival. So taking AA to be 1, the fitness of this would be 4 by 5, that is 0.8, and this would be 0.6. Right? And the average fitness now would be the frequency of these genotypes into the fitness of each of these genotypes. Okay? Now, given that the frequency of allele A, capital A, is 0.5, the frequency of the genotype would be so the probability of drawing 2 such alleles would be 0.5 into 0.5. So this frequency would be 0.25. The frequency of the heterozygote would be 0.5, because you can have a combination like this or a combination like this, and the frequency of the other homozygote would be 0.25. So here you would have 0.8 into 0.25 plus 1 into 0.5 plus 0.6 into 0.25, right? So what does that work out to be? It's something that's less than 1. Yes, I think. So if we the genetic load in this case would be 1 minus this, which is 0.15. So it means that 15% of these individuals would not survive till reproduction at all. And therefore, if every individual only replaced itself, the population size would decrease over time because some of these individuals are not surviving. And for the population to remain constant or to increase, you would need a surplus number of individuals in order to make up for that genetic load. Right? So the cost of selection would be the proportion of individuals that die due to selection divided by the proportion that survive, and this would be summed up over all the generations till the most favorable allele gets fixed in the population. Therefore, here that would be the genetic load by the average fitness. Right? Now, if you had a very small load of say 0.001, then the fitness would be say 0.999, but this could be at one locus. Right? Supposing you had 10,000 genes or 10,000 loci where polymorphism was maintained, then the load would be so the fitness then would be 0.999 to the power 10,000, which would be a very small number. Right? And therefore, the genetic load overall would be very high. So if you looked at the cost of selection would be a very high load divided by some very small number. Therefore, the number of excess individuals that are required every generation for the population to be made up to a constant size would be very large. So if you calculate this with a load of 0.001 per locus, and you take say 9,000 loci, you can come up with something like several thousands, which would be the number of excess reproduction required per individual in the population, which is impossible. Right? So you cannot have several thousand individuals having to be replaced by a single human every generation. Right? So it tells you that the cost of selection can be very high even if you invoke a very small load per locus. Now, there are so based on these calculations, Haldane suggested that a diploid population could not tolerate more than one substitution per 300 generations. Now, there are some problems with the genetic load. One is that we assume hard selection as opposed to soft selection. Yeah. So, correct. So this doesn't seem to work. So if we assume balancing selection, then we would have a very high cost of selection. So the problem is that we find a lot of genetic variability, but if we assume balancing selection, the cost of selection is very high. So at this point, we cannot invoke balancing selection at all of these loci to explain the polymorphism at several loci. So that is why the neutral theory, that's where the neutral theory comes in. There are some problems with the genetic load. One is that we are assuming here that we are assuming hard selection, and hard selection is where you have a selective agent that also controls the population size. So for instance, if you had bacteria on a plate and you had some with antibiotic resistance and some without, and you expose them to some antibiotics, the ones that have resistance towards those antibiotics will survive. The ones that don't have the resistance will not be able to survive. Right? So antibiotic here is the selective agent, and that is also what is keeping the population at some particular number. Right? So that is equivalent to this situation, because here you're assuming that every genotype has some particular probability of survival, and it is not to do with they are not kept under limiting conditions by the amount of resources that are available. On the other hand, supposing you had a situation where there are two different types in this population, but that food is a limiting factor, and therefore if this type reduces in number, this type can increase because they are limited by food. Right? So the total population size is kept to some level just by the resource availability. It is not to do with its inherent survival. That would be soft selection. So if we assume only competition here, then you would not have this problem of the population decreasing every generation. Right? The other thing is that we are assuming that all of these loci, those 10,000 loci, have independent effects and they are multiplicative across loci, which may also not be true. But nevertheless, you still have this problem that you can have a very large cost of selection, and that would not be conducive to having all of this variation through balancing mechanisms. So Kimura came up with what is called the neutral theory. And according to the neutral theory, there are different forms of variance at loci. These are different alleles. But these alleles are not selectively different from each other. So all of them are equivalent. So you could have allele capital A or small a, but capital A does not confer any benefit greater than small a. So any of them is selectively neutral. Okay, they are selectively equivalent. And therefore, the polymorphisms in the population would not be maintained by balancing selection, but they would be maintained by a combination of mutation and drift. So we'll look at genetic drift. Genetic drift is the phenomenon where you have random changes in allele frequencies in the population, which results from sampling error. So if you had all of these being alleles, you have two types of alleles here, the red and the yellow. And in one generation, you have these alleles. In the next generation, when you sample from these alleles, you get, because of sampling error, a different number of yellow alleles here and a different number of red alleles. And you can go on to the next generation and you can get a different number again. So you can go from having equal frequencies of red and yellow to all of them being red just through sampling error. Right? So for instance, if you looked at two individuals which have these alleles at one particular locus, this can give you the alleles, the gametes with the alleles A1 and A2, and you could have here A2 and A3, right? So there are different combinations that are possible. You could have offspring with A1, A2, 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 A1, A3, and A2, A3. Now, if these two individuals were only going to replace themselves, so you would have two offspring, you would have 2 out of these 4 combinations. So you are not going to get all the realizations here of whatever is possible. So you can have sampling error like this, where just by chance, you happen to have some combinations in the next generation, and therefore the allele frequencies change from one generation to the next. And therefore, if you had some number of alleles in one generation, after several generations, you could lose genetic variability through drift until you end up with only one allele. And this is happening without any selection. So there is no selective advantage of having one particular allele here. Therefore, balancing selection was not invoked by the neutralist school. And if there were deleterious alleles, they would be removed through purifying selection. And occasional advantageous alleles could again go to fixation, but drift is really playing a very big role here. Now, if the population size is large, then drift has a very small role. If the population size is small, you can have a lot of random fluctuations in allele frequencies, and therefore drift plays an important role. Also, according to the neutral theory, the regions of the sequence that are functionally unconstrained would be the ones that show the most number of changes. Okay. So if we look at a sequence if we looked at these third positions of the codons, which are substituted to give the same amino acid, then you would find that those positions should have a lot of substitutions compared to the first and second positions, which give you different amino acids, which therefore can have some selective benefit or cost. Now, according to the neutral theory, we know that the rate of nucleotide substitution at a site would be the number of mutations that occur into the probability that they get fixed. So by so if you start off from some sequence, and after some time, this position now changes to this here, right? And then again, after some time, we have so these are substitutions. You can get changes in the sequence by substituting one nucleotide with an other nucleotide. Right? So this is a substitution as opposed to a deletion where you just lose a nucleotide, or an addition where a nucleotide is inserted. So you can have an insertion here. Now, if we look at substitution, the rate at which these substitutions occur over time would be equal to the number of new mutations that arise every generation into the probability that they get fixed. So if we have a population, the so you can have errors while copying. So that would be one form of having new mutations occurring. I mean, you can have external agents that, like UV rays or chemicals, which again cause mutations also. So if we have a population size of n individuals, and these are diploid individuals, which means they have two sets of homologous chromosomes. So the number of new mutations would be 2 into n into mu, if mu is the mutation rate per generation. And because these alleles are all equivalent, any of these 2n alleles is the same as any of the others as far as selection is concerned. So the probability of fixation would just be 1 in 2n. Right? So if we want to look at the rate of nucleotide substitution, that would be 2n mu into 1 by 2n, which is simply mu. Right? So according to the neutral theory, the rate of random fixation of these neutral mutations across evolutionary time is simply equal to the rate at which these mutations arise. It is just the mutation rate. Okay. So you find that there is no effect of population size here. So the rate of substitution across time is simply equal to the mutation rate, and population size does not come into it. And of course, since the time between, since the rate of mutation is mu, the time between successive mutations would be 1 by mu. And so if you look at the gene frequencies across time, if you had a moderately sized population and versus a small population, the time between these new substitutions is the same in both of these populations, irrespective of the population size. But the time that it takes for a mutation to get fixed, that depends on population size, that is 4Ne. And therefore, here, this takes a longer time to get fixed than in the small population. And the other thing is that the time to loss is much smaller than the time to fixation. So you will find a lot of new mutations that arise and just get lost, while a few mutations finally get fixed. Huh. That would depend on your mutation rate. On the other hand, if we have a moderate sized population with different mutation rates, then the time to fixation would be, the time between successive fixations would be smaller in the scenario where mutation rate is high. So as I was saying before, if the neutral theory were true, then we should find that functionally unconstrained regions have more variability than functionally constrained regions. So if we look at synonymous substitutions which give rise to the same amino acids, you would find that there were mutations in the third position with giving rise to synonymous codons much more frequently than mutations in the first and the second position, which is what is seen. On the other hand, if most of the divergence was due to adaptive change in these within nucleotides, then you would find that there would be more changes in the first and the second positions compared to the third position. Now, we can also look at what kind of variability is expected given the neutral theory. So, there are different types of models. One is called the infinite alleles model, where every allele on undergoing a substitution will give rise to a completely new allele. So, you can have, say, allele A1, you have allele A2, if there's a mutation you have allele A3 and so on. So, you have an infinite number of alleles possible according to the infinite alleles model, and one can look at what is the expected number of alleles in a population that follows the neutral theory and the infinite alleles model. First, we'll look at what is the probability of autozygosity. Now, we can differentiate between alleles that are identical by descent and identical by state. So, if you have these individuals, and this individual I at some locus has the genotype A1, A1. Now, because these two alleles are both A1 at that particular locus, this is a homozygote, and because they are both A1, in state they are the same. Okay. But it is also possible that these two alleles are identical by descent, that is, they came from one copy of this A1. Okay. So, for instance, if this individual's grandparents had a single common, came from one particular individual here, then they could have transmitted that copy of A1 from this individual, and therefore it could get two copies of that same allele that had come from one single allele initially, and therefore these two would also be identical by descent. Okay. So, to calculate autozygosity, we can construct a pedigree like this. So, you trace their ancestors and look at the probability that this A1 allele has is identical by descent with this A1 allele. So, if this ancestor had an A1 allele, the probability that that would be transmitted to the offspring would be, half, right? Again, if you had an A1 allele here, the probability that it came here would be half. Similarly, you would have half and half. Now, the probability that these two share the same A1 allele would depend on whether this individual A itself had alleles that were identical by descent or not. So, if you had some alpha 1 and alpha 2 as the alleles present in A, now this alpha 1 and alpha 2 are not equivalent to A1 and A2. It is not the state, it is just referring to the identity. Okay. So, you could have this A producing gametes alpha 1 and alpha 1 that were given to these two, or you could have alpha 2 that were transmitted to these two offspring, or you could have alpha 1 and alpha 2 or alpha 2 and alpha 2. Right? If they were inherited in according to the laws of Mendel, you would have all of these being equal in probability. So you have 1/4 of each of these types. So if the same allele alpha 1 was passed on to both B and C, then these are identical by descent. So you would have a quarter here for that combination and a quarter here. Now alpha 1 and alpha 2 would also give rise to a situation of identity by descent if A1 itself was autozygous. So that would depend on the autozygosity of A, which we can call f of A. Right? So the autozygosity of this individual I would depend on the probability that it got these two from a single common ancestor, which is the multiplicative product of all of these, because all of these are independent events. Right? So you would have half into half into this half into 1 plus f of A. Right? So depending on the number of, if you had I ancestors on that, I individuals on that path, you would have half to the power I into 1 plus f of A. So that is the probability that I is autozygous for those alleles. Now, if we look at a diploid population, where we had 2n alleles, this is at time t minus 1, and then we go to the next generation, we go to another generation at time t. If we want to look at the probability of two gametes in a zygote having alleles that are identical by descent, they could be identical by descent either from this previous generation t minus 1, or they may not be identical by descent at that generation, but they might be identical by descent if you went back in time. Right? So the probability that you pick two gametes here and they come from the same gamete in the previous generation would be 1 by 2ne or 1 by 2n, right? Because you can have, if you had one particular gamete that you wanted to see whether both of these came from, there are 1 by 2n gametes here. So the probability that both of these came from this particular gamete would be 1 by 2n the whole square. And there are 2n such gametes. So the probability that two gametes that you picked came from any one of these would be 1 by 2n the whole square into 2n. So that would be 1 by 2n. You can ignore this NE. NE refers to the effective population size, and I think you will be doing that later. So you could have two gametes coming from the t minus 1th generation with probability 1 by 2 NE. And if they came from the same allele in that previous generation, the autozygosity of that would be 1, right? Because it came from the same allele. It is also possible that they didn't come from the same allele in the previous generation. So that would be 1 minus 1 by 2 NE. And it could, whether they are identical by descent then would depend on the autozygosity in the previous generation. So you get this recursion where Ft would be 1 by 2 Ne plus 1 minus 1 by 2 Ne into the autozygosity in generation T minus 1. Okay. Now, if the two alleles have to also be identical by state, then they should not have mutated from the previous generation. So if we have a mutation rate mu, the probability that they didn't mutate would be 1 minus mu, and therefore this whole thing would have to be multiplied into 1 minus mu, the whole square, because both of them didn't mutate. Right? So at mutation drift equilibrium, Ft would be equal to Ft minus 1 would simply be equal to F, which is the homozygosity, the probability that an individual is homozygous, and therefore that is approximately equal to 1 by 1 plus 4 Ne mu, if you work that out. Yeah. 4 Ne mu is often written as theta. It would be 2 Ne mu if the population was haploid rather than diploid, and that is a measure of the overall mutation rate of the population. Now, if we use, so F was what we found so far. If we take the reciprocal of F, you can get a measure of the effective number of alleles in the population. So, because if all the alleles are equally frequent, you will have the highest heterozygosity possible or the lowest homozygosity possible. If alleles differ in their frequencies, then the homozygosity will be higher than if alleles were equal in their frequencies. Okay. So, the reciprocal of F can be used as a measure of the effective number of alleles in the population. And here you can see in this table that if you had very large effective population size on the rows there, on those columns there, and you had a high mutation rate that corresponds to this row, then you get the largest number of alleles, which is in every alternate row here. This is the homozygosity. These are the number of alleles. On the other hand, if you have a low effective population size or you have a low mutation rate, you will have few alleles. So you need to have a combination of high effective population size and high mutation rate to have a very large number of alleles. Now, what we looked at was the infinite alleles model. And in the infinite alleles model, any allele that arises in the population, any mutation that arises gives rise to a new allele. There are also other models. One is the stepwise mutation model, where we assume that mutations proceed in a stepwise fashion, and this is especially true of microsatellite loci. Microsatellites are repeat regions, repeats of 2 to 5 nucleotides, which could be like this, where you have some sequence on the side and you have this portion where you have AC repeated several times. Okay. So this microsatellite allele with 4 such repeats could be called, say, A. We could have another allele with with 5 such repeats, and you could call this another allele B and so on. Now, because of this nature of the microsatellite with these repeat regions, when the DNA is being replicated, there is a chance of the DNA that is being replicated to slip, so that you could form small loops like this, and therefore increase the repeat number or decrease the repeat number by one repeat. So you would have a situation where you can go from having 4 such AC repeats to 5 AC repeats to 6 AC repeats, or from here to 4 and 3 and so on. And there's a much lower probability of suddenly jumping from, say, 3 AC repeats to 20 AC repeats. So this would be a stepwise mutation where you go with a greater probability to repeat numbers that are that increase by 1. So if you had the stepwise mutation model as opposed to the infinite alleles model, of course the number of alleles that you expect would be much smaller in the stepwise mutation model than under an infinite alleles model, which is given by this line. There is also what is called the infinite sites model, where we can take into account the actual nucleotides in the sequence as opposed to just calling the entire thing an allele. So if you had, say, if you had 4 sequences like this, we often find that because mutation rates are very low, there are only some sites in this entire sequence that show variability at all across sequences. And even at those sites where there is variability, there are often only 2 alternative nucleotides. So you find at this position that you have either an A or a T. At this position, you have either an A or a T, but at all. And there are some sites which are variable. Even the sites that are variable have only 2 alternative nucleotides. The infinite sites model is very useful because you can look at what kinds of differences are there between individuals, and that can give you insights into the population processes. Now, we'll I have time till 11. Right? We'll quickly go through some models of sequence divergence. First, we'll look at amino acids and then at DNA sequences. So, if you had an amino acid such as this is an amino acid sequence, after some interval of time t, if this amino acid sequence diverges to give these 2 sequences, so it has accumulated some differences in this time t. And if the rate of amino acid replacement was lambda per site per time, then dt represents the proportion of differences in those amino acid sequences. Okay. Now, dt plus 1 would be equal to the differences that already existed, that was dt, plus the sites that were not different, so that's 1 minus dt, into the change that happened per unit time. But here, although this amount of time corresponds to t, you have that amount of time along this lineage as well as that lineage. So the actual amount of time that is separating them is 2t. Okay. So you would get 1 minus dt into 2 lambda, because there is twice the amount of this time available for mutations to accumulate between them. So if we take t minus 1, sorry, t plus 1 minus dt, that would be equal to 1 minus dt by 2 lambda. So you can take 1 minus dt by so if we integrate this, then you get dt equal to 1 minus e to the power minus 2 lambda t if you integrate from 0 to t. Now you can look at the number of substitutions per site that are expected between two sequences at time t. So the expected number of substitutions k would be equal to 2t into lambda, because lambda is the rate at which changes are occurring, and 2t is the time available for these substitutions to occur. So k is equal to 2 lambda t. We can get 2 lambda t from there, and therefore get the k, you can get k hat equal to minus log of 1 minus d hat, where d hat is the observed number of differences you find between those two sequences. So this means that as the number of substitutions per site keep increasing, the observed divergence that you find does not keep increasing. It plateaus off after a while. Okay? So you can have, if you look at only the observed divergence, that would be an underestimate of the divergence that has actually happened. And that is because you can keep coming back to the same sequences after a long period of time. For instance, if we look at a nucleotide sequence, and after some period of time you have, say, this, if you went from T to A at this nucleotide position and then went back from A to T, and you looked at two sequences that only had this, you would not know that there had been change in between, right? So if you look at your observed differences at some point in time, they could be underestimates of the actual amount of substitutions that have taken place. And when you are comparing different sequences, when you find that they have this similarity, when you're comparing sequences and you find that you have this problem where the same nucleotides, after some interval of time, have mutated back to a common state, you would call that a homoplasy. This is a problem especially with phylogenetic, with constructing phylogenetic trees. Now, the assumptions in this are that substitutions occur independent of one another, and that it occurs at the same rate through time, and all amino acid replacements can occur with equal likelihood. So any amino acid can get converted to any other amino acid with equal likelihood, which is usually not the case. But there are more complicated models to address these problems. We will also look at the rate of sequence divergence. If instead of taking amino acids, we look at some sequence and look at how the sequence diverges across time. So we have some time t, and then we have these two new sequences. We can, if we assume that every nucleotide can mutate with equal probability to any other nucleotide. So A can go to T or C or G with probability alpha, and any of these can also go to any of the others with probability alpha. And we also assume equal nucleotide frequencies. This is the most basic model called the Jukes-Cantor model, where we are accounting for multiple substitutions. Okay. So the probability that some site has the nucleotide A at time t is given as PA, and if you look at time t plus 1, the probability that the site has a nucleotide A at time t plus 1 would be the probability that it had A at time t into the probability that it did not mutate to any of the other 3 nucleotides, which would be 1 minus 3 alpha, because alpha is the probability of it mutating to any one of the other nucleotides. So 1 minus 3 alpha would be the probability that this did not mutate to any of the other nucleotides, plus the probability that it was not A at time t, therefore that is 1 minus PAT, into the probability that it mutated to alpha, to A. So that is into alpha. Right? So again, we can do the same thing as before, and take dPAT by dt, and on integrating you get this. Okay. PAT equal to 1 by 4 plus 3 by 4 into e to the power minus 4 alpha t. This is for one particular sequence. If we look at the probability that two sequences that were separated t time ago continue to have the same nucleotide at that site, then this time would become 2t, because as we saw earlier, there are, if two sequences are separated by time t, each of them has time t to undergo substitutions, and therefore this becomes minus 8 alpha t. And the probability that they don't carry the same nucleotide would be 1 minus PAA, which can be written as D. So therefore D is equal to 1 minus this, and from this we can get 8 alpha t. Right? We already saw that the rate of mutation to a different nucleotide, which can be written as lambda, is 3 alpha, because there is an equal chance of going from any nucleotide to any other nucleotide. And the expected proportion of sites that differ between two sites, k, would be equal to 2 lambda into t, and therefore that's equal to 6 alpha t. And therefore we can get a measure of the corrected nucleotide substitutions that have happened. This is corrected by taking multiple substitutions into account, and that is minus 3 by 4 into log of 1 minus 4 by 3d, which is the Jukes-Cantor distance. So in the Jukes-Cantor model, we assume that there is there are equal nucleotide frequencies, and that any nucleotide can go to any other nucleotide with equal probability. In practice, you often find that every nucleotide does not go to any other nucleotide with equal probability, so you can have more complicated models. The first is the Kimura's two-parameter model, which assumes that transition rates can be different from transversion rates. The cytosine and thymine are called pyrimidines, and adenine and guanine are purines. So if you go from one pyrimidine to another pyrimidine, or you go from one purine to another purine, that is called a transition. While if there is a substitution of a purine with a pyrimidine or vice versa, that would be called a transversion. So here you can have two different rates, one rate of transition. So you have adenine to guanine there with alpha, or cytosine to thymine there also with alpha, and you have a different transversion rate. You don't. These are models of substitution. And here again, we assume equal nucleotide frequencies. Now we can also go from the Jukes-Cantor model or the Kimura's two-parameter model to more complex models by assuming unequal nucleotide frequencies. So, for instance, you have the Tajima-Ne model, where you have only one rate of conversion from any nucleotide to any other nucleotide, but you have unequal nucleotide frequencies. Therefore, there would be 4 parameters in that model as opposed to 1 here, because there are 4 nucleotide frequencies, but once you know 3 of them, you know the 4th. So there would be 3 parameters corresponding to the 3 nucleotide frequencies that are unknown, and 1 that corresponds to the rate of substitution. From the Kimura's two-parameter model, you can add unequal nucleotide frequencies and get the Tamura's T92, with you have only 2 types of nucleotide frequencies here, AC versus GC, AT versus GC, and in the HKY85 and F84 models, you assume 4 different nucleotide frequencies, so they are 5-parameter models. There is also the Tamura-Ne model, which assumes 2 different transition rates and not just 1 transition rate. So you can have a different transition rate for the purines, another one for the pyrimidines, and a third for the transversions, plus unequal nucleotide frequencies. And the generalized time reversible model, which is the most general model, where there is a different substitution rate from any nucleotide to any of the other nucleotides, plus 4 different equilibrium-based frequencies. So there are 10 parameters in that model. Now, to any of these, you can also add the the proportion of invariant sites as a parameter. Usually, if you look at sequences, you find that there are some proportion of sites that don't have any mutations, and there might be some site here that has mutations. You have sites which don't have mutations. So if a large part of your sequence does not have any variability at all, you could use that proportion. So you might have 80% of your sequence not having any variability at all. So the proportion of invariant sites can also be taken into account, as well as the distribution of mutation rates. So it is not necessary that the mutation rate is uniform across the entire sequence. So it is possible that you have a distribution of mutation rates where there are some proportion of sites which have very high mutation. You could have some proportion, a large proportion of sites that have low mutation rates, and you can have a small proportion of sites that have high mutation rates. So you could have these mutation hotspots. So those could also be taken into account when you are modeling sequence divergence. I think I'll stop.